Welcome students. Today our topic is the power and influence of the Supreme Court. We're going to look at some important historic developments that have shaped the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court's level of power, and discuss how those changes happen and what kind of specific effects they have and how that shapes the role of the Supreme Court today. So it's important that you remember that the Supreme Court can exercise some pretty serious power today, but it was not always as influential as it is now. At the beginning of our country, the Supreme Court was not as powerful, not as big of a deal as it is now. And what changed that into what it's more like today is the actions of one man we're going to discuss first. And that person was a guy named John Marshall. John Marshall is the person who sort of sets the stage for developing a strong Supreme Court the way that we have it now. So please remember that prior to John Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice who lived in served in the early 1800s, the Supreme Court was not powerful, had very little power. But thanks to the efforts of this man, John Marshall, some changes were made, got the ball rolling, and turned the Supreme Court into a powerful and influential institution. So let's talk a little bit about who John Marshall was. He was our fourth Chief Justice of the United States. And as you can see from the dates on the screen, he was doing his thing in the early 1800s. So our country is still a young place in terms of it's not been too many years since the Constitution has been ratified. But he came onto the Supreme Court and kind of had a goal of making the court, the federal court, an equal branch with the other two branches of government. He thought that the courts could exercise some really serious power to hold the rest of the government in check and make some important changes that needed to be made. And the way that he made these changes was with the decisions that he directed or influenced his court, his fellow justices to make. So we're going to talk about the changes that he ushered in with the decisions that he made. The effect was that the court became a branch of government with sort of more equal footing. John Marshall is recognized as the person who ushered in that important change. He did it with a decision, started the ball rolling with a decision in a case called Marbury versus Madison. This is a case that goes all the way back to 1803. So very early in John Marshall's term as Chief Justice. This case comes before the Supreme Court, and at the time, people thought it was just a simple matter that they needed the Supreme Court to decide, but John Marshall turned deciding a simple matter into something that was much more of a big deal, that established a precedent that helped increase the Supreme Court's level of power. So here's what happened. The two people involved in this case are John Marbury and James Madison. You probably recognize James Madison. He is the architect of the Constitution. He's going to be a president one day after this. Marbury, I doubt you know very much about him. He's not as famous. John Marbury was a political appointee, somebody with a government job that had been selected by President John Adams to serve in this government job right at the end of John Adams' administration. So John Adams serves as president for one term. He gets to put some people into government jobs. One of them is John Marbury, but he doesn't get around to giving John Marbury this government job until literally the last days of his administration. So Marbury gets his job, but the next president comes in the next day, and that president happens to be Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson instructed his Secretary of State, who was James Madison, to remove those people that had been put into place by John Adams. And this, of course, meant Marbury lost his job. He had just gotten the other day. So this, of course, makes Marbury fairly upset, and he sues Madison for taking away his job. This issue goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could have looked at this and said, yeah, we're either going to give Marbury his job back or not, but John Marshall recognized that there was a deeper issue here, and he pursued that. The deeper issue was that the law that created the job for John Marbury was a law that was called the Judicial Act. And the Judicial Act, the way that John Marshall read it, did not conform with the rules spelled out in the United States Constitution. So in addition to deciding on the particular issue of Marbury's job, the Supreme Court looked at whether or not the Judicial Act was something that was constitutional, and they decided that it was not. So in doing this, they practiced what we refer to as judicial review for the very first time. And it created a precedent that empowered the Supreme Court with this ability to review actions of the government and declare them either constitutional or unconstitutional. So this is the first time that the Supreme Court struck down a law. They struck down the Judicial Act. Marbury didn't get his job, but more importantly for all of us, the Supreme Court gained a new power, which is the ability to review a law that's brought before them in a case and decide whether or not that law conforms to the Constitution. That's judicial review. Excuse me. So what this does is it sort of sets up a little bit more of an equal dynamic between the judicial branch and the other branches. Because the judicial branch now is empowered, thanks to Marbury versus Madison and John Marshall, with the ability to review the actions of Congress and the President, it puts them in a position where they get to act more like referees at a sporting event. So they get to make all the calls as to whether or not something is appropriate or not. And this gives them a serious amount of power. They can stop an action of Congress. They can stop an action of the President. They can strike down a law that is unconstitutional or unfair or violates people's rights. This judicial review concept is what gives the Supreme Court its real power in checking and balancing the other branches of government. So that brings us to discussing sort of what the purpose of the Supreme Court and the judicial branch is, and how this judicial review power influences that. So remember that the purpose of courts is to interpret the law. They take a specific situation and they figure out how the general law applies to that. So they are, in a sense, tasked with giving meaning to laws and to actions that are done by the President or other executives. So they can take a general law and applying it to a specific situation, give that law more meaning, a more clear definition. We'll talk about this in more specific detail in class. Quite importantly for us is the Supreme Court's ability to use judicial review to strike down acts that exceed the power given to government by the Constitution. Because in a lot of cases, when the government steps over its bounds, is doing something that's not necessarily good for the people. So it's the Supreme Court's and the court system's responsibility to step in and say, no, you cannot do that. That infringes upon people's rights, or it is not something that we deem to be an appropriate exercise of government power. So using judicial review is a way that the Supreme Court can hold the other branches of government to within the limits of the power that the Constitution gives them, which is very important, particularly if a society is concerned about being able to exercise freedom. You don't want your government to overreach its power, become authoritarian. And this affects us most directly because, in many cases, laws that the Supreme Court will strike down using judicial review happen to be laws that are, in some way or another, violations of our individual rights and freedoms that are protected by the Bill of Rights. So the court can look at a law, compare it to what the Bill of Rights says, and if that law is doing something the Bill of Rights says is not appropriate for the government to do, like, say, take away your freedom of religion or speech or something like that, they can strike down that law. And this becomes a really important tool for us, the people, in protecting our rights. These important rights that are spelled out in the Bill of Rights and also from other places. The Supreme Court uses this judicial review power to protect our rights by making sure that unfair laws are struck down. So bring your examples and your questions to class, and we'll discuss this further when we get together.